Be quite a mouth. Okay, let me start that again. So I want to thank everyone for being here for this continuing study in the book of Romans. And for those of you who were here last week, we began our study into chapters 1 through 4 of the book of Romans. And we got about as far as chapter 1 because there's just so much material there and it's so dense and so much that's interesting, but we couldn't get very far beyond that. So I want to try to do my best today in the couple of hours that we have to get through chapters 2 to 4, which is quite a mouthful, but I believe that we can do it, at least do a job over the surface. We won't be able to go too far in depth. And believe me when I tell you there's just so much there to cover and so much to go into. And you go one verse and it leads you to another, and you go to one passage and it leads you to Galatians, you go here and it leads you there to Genesis, and you're all over the place. And it's fascinating and it's wonderful, but it would take truly an entire course to be able to go through this material carefully. And I'm still learning many of these things myself in a new way as I go through different resources that Yahweh has exposed me to. And I try to share those with you as often as I get that understanding. And as I develop a greater understanding myself, I do my best to share it with you. And upon sharing it with you, I also learn it and internalize it. And then it becomes part of me forever. So I thank Almighty Yahweh for revealing his word to us and for giving us better understanding and helping us to mature in the understanding of his word. And I think that these things are incredibly encouraging because they help us to truly understand our position, our identity in Almighty Yahweh as individuals, but also collectively as the body of Messiah. So without further ado, let's turn to Romans chapter 1, and I'll just do a very quick recap of where we were last week, promise, and then we'll go over to chapter 2. So I'm going to turn over to, we're going to be looking at different translations as I normally do. We'll be looking at NIV today, New International Version. We'll also be looking at NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, NASB, New American Standard Bible, and each of those has their strengths and their weaknesses. And of course, as the main text, I'm going to be using the more modern Kingdom New Testament, and that's where we are right now in the Kingdom New Testament. So if we turn to Romans 1, just a very quick recap. Let me see if I can just reduce this margin just a little bit. So just bear with me a minute, okay? Let's see. Okay, there we go. All right, so Romans chapter 1 begins a description of Paul's declaration to the Roman brothers and sisters, combination of Jewish and Gentile believers in Rome. And he mentions to them that he's been trying to get to them for a long time. However, he's not been successful for different reasons. Different obstacles have gotten in his way, but that he wanted to meet with them as soon as possible. And he characterizes himself as a slave, a doulos, a servant, a bondservant to King Yahshua, to the Messiah Yahshua, which is an indication of his measure of faith and dedication and loyalty to Almighty Yahweh. And then he talks about his commission, him being set apart for Yahweh's good news, his gospel, his evangel, his message that Yahweh promised through his prophets in the scriptures about his son descended from David and who was marked out by Yahweh in terms of the spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead, which is an indication of Yahweh fulfilling his promises through his son of that gospel message. So I pointed out that the gospel message is what you would find in places like Isaiah 40, comfort you, my people. And then he goes on and describes the gospel message, but also a place like Isaiah 52, really Isaiah 40 through 55, that really long poem that incorporates the servant songs, but especially Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 52, where it describes how blessed the person is who brings forth the good news, the message. And that good news is a herald of Yahweh's kingdom. And that, of course, is fulfilled in Yahshua the Messiah, as he goes on to elaborate throughout the book of Romans, but also in different letters and books as well. So he talks about he starts setting the pace here in Romans chapter 1, where he talks about how through him, the nations are also blessed. He's going to elaborate in very great detail on that as we continue through the letter, but he just sort of introduces that idea, right? That verse 6, that includes you too, who are called by Yahshua the King, and it's coming to all in Rome who are called to be his holy people. He says, again, he's trying to make his way to them, and he wants to encourage them, and he wants to bear fruit in them. And then, give me a second here. I'm struggling with this here. Okay. And then he starts into, he goes into a really important section here from verses 14 to 17, where he describes the good news. And he says, with regard to his commission, that he's been sent not only to the Jews, but also to the nations. And he's eager to announce the good news to them, and he's not ashamed of it, because it's Yahweh's power. This is verse 16 of chapter 1. It's Yahweh's power bringing salvation to everyone who believes. So I titled this study, Yahweh's Plan to Save the World, on the basis of verse 16, among others, right? It's Yahweh's power to bring salvation to the world. It's his plan to save the world. And I mean that quite literally. To the Jew first, and also equally to the Greek representing any of the nations and barbarians in verse 14. And then verse 17 is very important. This is because Yahweh's covenant justice, and other versions will have righteousness, right? It's that term righteousness, dikaiosune. This is because Yahweh's covenant justice is unveiled in it. What is it? It is the gospel message, right? It's the good news. From faithfulness to faithfulness. In other words, from Yahweh's faithfulness. And when we read these things and we just kind of gloss over them, we miss it. And because it's sort of complicated unless you're looking at it from the perspective of other scriptural passages and looking at each term by term. So that term righteousness means something very specific, as we're going to see. And you'll see that throughout this translation, Professor Wright has translated that term righteousness as covenant justice. He didn't just pull that out of thin air. He did that for very specific reasons that'll become clear, especially as you go into chapter 3 and even more so chapter 4. And that's critical to understanding this passage, this book, as you'll see. That idea of covenant justice is so important. And it removes, from my perspective, it removes so much of the confusion that we've learned over the years with regard to the book of Romans, because I believe that most people who expound upon the book of Romans are looking at that term righteousness, or the term, as you'll see it in some versions, oftentimes justification, Yahweh's justification or his righteousness. You'll see that term justification is thrown about in a very esoteric sort of way. It's kind of like there's this theological aura about that term, as around many terms, where you kind of hear it and it sounds like a very churchy thing, right? A very churchy theological thing that doesn't have any real down-to-earth application to us. So we just kind of take it for granted, shrug, okay, I guess it says what it says, and this justification, whatever that means. And if you've never felt that way before, then you're on a different plane than I am, because for years and years, I never properly understood that term justification. And I think that I finally have it nailed down to a point where at least it makes sense to me in the day-to-day. And it's a legal term. It's a court term. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But terms like faithfulness, same thing. Faithfulness means something specific. It's the loyalty that Almighty Yahweh has. It's the faithfulness. It's the dedication and the loyalty that we have towards him and the loyalty that he has towards us. But it also has to do with, once again, in relation to the term righteousness or justification, it has to do also with the faithfulness to the covenant. And that's the undertone throughout all of this that you need to keep in mind consistently as we go through the book of Romans and as you go through Galatians. And by the way, Galatians is more than likely what I'm, Yahweh willing, what I'm planning to cover during the Feast of Tabernacles this year. That is my plan, to go through the entire book of Galatians. So in detail. So more on that later, unless I change my mind from here to then, but I'm really feeling it in my heart to do that. So more on that later. But faithfulness to faithfulness. This is because Yahweh's covenant justice, his righteousness, is unveiled in the gospel, is unveiled in it. From faithfulness, Yahweh's faithfulness, to from faithfulness, uh, 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 Yahweh's faithfulness to our faithfulness, or is it the other way around? I have to double check the translations. The point is, though, that there's an interchange in faithfulness that's happening here. There's the faithfulness of Almighty Yahweh in granting us this status of being right in the sense of this covenant justice, and then it's being also it's also us granting to Yahweh the full loyalty and dedication on the basis of that relationship, that covenant relationship that we have with one another. As it says in the scriptures, the just shall live by faith. And that's a quote from Habakkuk. Okay. Or Habakkuk, however you want to pronounce it. Then he starts talking about sort of laying the foundation of where we're going with this. And he starts out with the problem, right? Well, what is the problem? Well, the problem is sin, but it's not just sin with a small s. It's sin with a capital S, if you will. And I'm just kind of inserting that interpretation there, but that's not some weird thing I'm teaching. It's like sin on an individual level, your sin, my sin, our lack of faithfulness to the covenant. But there's a greater thing to keep in mind here. Again, another undertone. Sin with a capital S. What does that mean? It'll become clearer in a little bit. So he's talking about the anger of Yahweh unveiled from heaven against all wickedness, against all injustice performed by people, verse 18, who use injustice to suppress the truth. And then he talks about in the next few verses about all the things that Almighty Yahweh has done for humankind, and instead humankind has embraced sinful things, idolatry, right? Idolatry is not at the root of the problem. You got to understand. What's at the root of the problem are the forces that idolatry represent. So idolatry is the economic forces that compete against Yahweh, the social forces that compete against Almighty Yahweh, what did I say? Social, the economic, the social forces, the economic, financial, the political forces, the ideas of power and leadership, right, and fame and celebrity and all those things that are contrary to the way that Yahweh does things. And he's talking here from verses 18 forward about all the different ways in which those forces are manifested in the world. And what that all results in is people turning away from the one who deserves our faithfulness, the one who deserves our complete loyalty, our complete dedication. And instead, they've given that to these other forces. In the book of Galatians, I think I pointed out last week, this concept of the elemental forces, the elemental things. That's what he's referring to. So we're instead of worshiping the one who created all these things and created systems for us to use, economic systems, social systems, not so much political, but leadership and government is maybe the better word to use. Governmental systems, appropriate ways of relating to one another and of governing and all those things, and handling finances and money, etc. Instead of using those ways that Yahweh gave us, we swap them for things that are alien to the scriptural ideas. So verse 23, they human beings, humanity, they swapped the glory of the immortal Elohim for the likeness of the image of mortal humans and of birds and animals and reptiles. So in other words, we started to worship the creature rather than the creator. And the result of all that is sin with a capital S, as humanity falls within the slavery to the elemental forces, right? So humanity, and this is the product of that is what you see around you today. That all you have to do is, turn on the news on any given day, and you see the results of that. The results of humankind's capitulation to sin. So when you're looking at all this, look at the big picture. Don't just look at it as the individual sins, the individual failings of any specific human being. And regrettably, that's one of the main ways in which, Christianity tends to look at these passages, is that this is just talking about, well, we're all sinful human beings and we're trying to figure out a way to deal with our own individual sins. And no, it's much greater than that. We're talking about a stain upon the entirety of humanity. It's not just about you and your individual little sins. And I don't mean to minimize that, but that's not what these things are talking about. It's talking about overall the slavery of the human race and how Yahweh is turning that upside its head. Because what he's doing is he's reversing the corruption of Eden, right? He's reversing the corruption of what happened in Eden. The fallen world in which we live, as represented by these things that you're seeing in the initial verses, he's turning it upside their head, in order that humanity could be saved, in order that humanity might be reconciled with him. And the way that reconciliation is to take place is through the agency of his son, of Yahshua the Messiah. But there are other things that have to be described from here until that point, because it's not just the problem of sin, but it's also the problem of what happened to the witness who was supposed to help us to him, back to him. And that witness is Israel, right? So if you read Isaiah 53, and we all know Isaiah 53 very well, that's the passage that, talks about the suffering servant, and that talks about how, he took our pain and bore our suffering, right? And yet we consider him punished by Elohim, stricken by him and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed, etc. Right? That very well-known passage. Well, if you ask a Jewish person, to whom is that referring? Well, the typical Jewish individual will say that's referring to Israel, right? And there was a time when I would have said, no, that's just totally wrong. And it's obviously this is talking about Yahshua the Messiah, and right. And clearly it is talking about Yahshua the Messiah. There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind, but they're not wrong that it's also referring to Israel. But what's happening is that you're seeing it's actually referring to Israel in earlier chapters, but by the time you get to Isaiah 53, it's not talking about the nation of Israel anymore. That suffering servant is referred to in a national sense in the prior chapters to Isaiah 53, but then there's a clear shift in the identity of that servant, where there is one individual, the pronouns shift, and it's referring to an individual, a he, not a they, and it's somebody that is clearly a representative, or maybe not so clearly to some people, but to me it's very clear that it is a representative of that nation. Why does that occur? Well, that occurs because of what you're seeing described here in the book of Romans, because Israel was commissioned to be a nation to serve as a witness to the rest of the world in order to turn us to the way that Yahweh wished for us to be. And yet, because they began to act in the same way as the nations did, they ultimately failed in their responsibility. So then here we have another interesting thing, and I'm just kind of giving you a preview of Romans and how these passages are oftentimes interpreted incorrectly, I believe. Then there's a certain line of thinking that says, well, so Israel failed in their responsibility, that much we can understand. So therefore Yahweh said, okay, made a mistake. Plan A is out the window, and now we got to go to Plan B, and Plan B is Yahshua the Messiah, etc. No. That's absolutely wrong. What would that say about? Think about it for a second. What would that say about Yahweh if he has this grand plan, and because Israel did not fulfill it, then he says, okay, made a mistake, got to start over again and start. No, that would not bode well for the one who created the initial plan. And there's no indication of that anywhere whatsoever in the scriptures. But what there is an indication of clearly is that Yahweh said, you know what, I'm going to fulfill exactly what I said I was going to do. But the way it's going to be done is going to be through one individual, one Israelite who is going to represent the entire nation who is going to do the exact same thing that all of them were supposed to do, and they didn't, they failed to do it collectively as a nation. I'm going to have this one sinless individual who's going to do this, and therefore I'm going to fulfill my word, because let every man be found a liar, but Yahweh is true to his word. More on that as we go through it. I'm just giving you a broad overview. So it says in verse 24, talking about going back to the problem of sin with a capital S, Elohim gave them up to uncleanness and the desires of their hearts. And then it talks about different ways in which, different manifestations of the ways in which people have dishonored themselves. And see, this is what has happened, that humanity has dishonored itself. Human beings have dishonored themselves. As he said, verse 23, they swapped the glory of the immortal Elohim. Well, what is that term glory? That term glory has a couple of different connotations. The term glory has to do with not only the glory of Yahweh, right? So when you think about the glory of Yahweh, what people refer to sometimes as the Shekinah, okay? Give me 1 second, please. Okay, hold on. Okay. So the glory is referring in one sense to the glory of Almighty Yahweh, okay, that is that departed from Israel. Why? Because Yahweh can't abide in the midst of sin. And the nation had gone into all the things that are being described here in Romans. So in Romans chapter 1, so they, instead of being an example to the nations, they fell into the same traps of the nations, and they fell into idolatry. And it was so, and obviously, can you imagine the offense to Almighty Yahweh, that the ones who are supposed to speak against that sort of thing are the ones who actually fall into it, right? So Yahweh departs from Israel, and ultimately you have to look at the Torah. You have to look at Deuteronomy 27 and forward, that describes the blessings and the curses, right? So Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 27 and forward and onward, the blessings and curses that are not spoken against particular individuals, right? We tend to look at those things as an individual type of thing. Those are national blessings and curses. So it's a description of, essentially sentence that is passed upon the nation if they would go in this direction as compared to the other. If they do well, blessings. If they don't do well, they're sentenced to curses. The ultimate curse of which was what? It was exile, right? So when you talk about in some places the curse of the law, the ultimate curse of the law is exile, okay? Because what is exile? Exile is banishment from the presence of Almighty Yahweh. Exile is being cast out of Eden, you see. That's exile. So that never underestimate the power, the strength, the pathos behind the idea of exile and what that has meant to the Jewish people. We don't think much about that in our day and age, because we've never experienced the pain of exile. We've never been sent away from our home, sent away from our land, but to a nation that has a history in it, right? And even people in the modern day probably don't, even among the Jews, probably don't think too much about that. But when you look at the scriptural context, the verses, the passages in the prophets, and the passages in the New Testament, you better believe that idea of exile is prominent, because it's such a painful part of the history of the nation. So much of what you're seeing described in the book of Romans is inveighing against those forces and those attitudes that eventually led to exile, that led to the curse of the law as represented by exile. So going back to Romans, so verse 24, he gave them up. It's like he said, okay, if you want to do this, go right ahead and see where that leads you. And it was downhill from there. And then down in verse 28, moreover, just as they did not see fit to hold on to knowledge of Elohim, Elohim gave them up to an unfit mind so that they would behave inappropriately. And then other things that they did, again, representative of this decline. Because what has happened? Going back to the glory, right? What has happened? Glory, as I said, represents two things. It represents the glory of Yahweh that departed from the people. You think about the book of Ezekiel, where you can the prophets saw the glory of Yahweh departing from Jerusalem, leaving and getting to the Mount of Olives and then departing. Okay. But then there's also the sense of humanity having despised his responsibility as an image bearer to reflect the glory of Almighty Yahweh to the rest of the earth. We're supposed to reflect his glory throughout the earth. And because our hearts became darkened with capital S, and we went into idolatry and sin, we abandoned, as humanity, abandoned that glory that was supposed to be ours. So the account of the entire rest of the Bible, particularly through the Messiah forward, is the description of getting our glory back. Getting our glory back, which will ultimately result in the glory of Israel coming back and dwelling with us as well. Does that make sense? So let's see more of that as we go through this. So when we get to chapter 2, he now starts, Paul, having sort of set the tone, he now begins to give a broader sense of how this all works, but in a more specific sense. So he says, so you have no excuse, anyone, whoever you are, who sit in judgment. Remember, he's addressing Jews and Gentiles. When you judge someone else, you condemn yourself, because you, who are behaving as a judge, are doing the same things. Elohim's judgment falls, we know, in accordance with the truth on those who do such things. But if you judge those who do them and yet do them yourself, do you really suppose that you will escape Yahweh's judgment? Or do you despise the riches of Yahweh's kindness, forbearance, and patience? Don't you know that Yahweh's kindness is meant to bring you to repentance? But by your hard, unrepentant heart, you are building up a store of anger for yourself on the day of anger, the day when Yahweh's just judgment will be unveiled. The Elohim who will repay everyone according to their works. When people patiently do what is good and so pursue the quest for glory and honor and immortality, Yahweh will give them the life of the age to come. But when people act out of selfish desire and do not obey the truth, but instead obey injustice, there will be anger and fury. There will be trouble and distress for every single person who does what is wicked, the Jew first, and also equally the Greek. You see that all the time in the book of Romans, the Jew first, and then equally the Greek. So why is this constant emphasis on the Jew first and then the Greek? The Jew first and then the Greek. Is it because the Jew is so special and the Greek is, inferior or secondary? No. It's the point that he's trying to make, that the Jew as the representative, the Israelite as the representative witness, was supposed to be the first to give example of these things. So he keeps emphasizing the Jewish person was the first one who was supposed to do it, and also the Greek. And Professor Wright says equally the Greek. In different translations will not have the term equally, but that's implied in the text. So the idea is that you're on an equal plane. So if you look at Ephesians, it talks about there's no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female. It's the same concept, right? That everyone has equal responsibility, but the Jew first, because the Jew had the primary responsibility. And he's building up to the problem here, right? That occurred. So there are two problems: the original problem of sin with a capital S, but the further problem of the one who was supposed to witness against that and lead the Greek to Yahweh, lead the nations to Yahweh, failed in their responsibility. So what happens? Does that mean we're all lost because that responsibility was not fulfilled? No, because as we're going to see, Yahweh himself stepped in and took matters into his own hands and said, okay, my people failed me, so I'm going to have to do it a different way, but I'm going to still fulfill it this way. But it's going to be through this Israelite, this perfect, innocent, who would fulfill my will, and that's Yahshua, of course. And there will be glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does, verse 10. There will be glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does what is good, the Jew first, and also equally the Greek. Yahweh, you see, shows no partiality. See, whether you're Jew or Greek, ultimately you're all part of one single family, and this is what he's getting at. And how you get to become one single family is what most of the rest of the book of Romans is about, right? So let's just go back just a little bit here in chapter 2. So what is the problem here? So give me 1 second, folks. I'm so sorry. Hold on. Okay, I'm still here. So what is the problem here? It's that he's building a sort of, not a problem, but what is the deal going on here? He's building sort of a legal case, because Paul is a lawyer, right? Paul is a trained Pharisee. Never forget that. The book of Romans, one of the reasons why the book of Romans is sort of difficult to comprehend, and you have to delve so much deeper because of the density of the material, is because Paul is speaking he's using a system of speaking and of arguing, and I don't mean arguing in a ugly sense, but of debate, if you will, or he's doing it in the form of a legal argument, because that is his training as a Pharisee. And a lot of times we, folks who totally misconstrue something like Paul's letter is because they don't remember, or they don't take into account, or they just don't know that about Paul. Paul was a Pharisee. He talks like a Pharisee. He acts like a Pharisee. He reasons as a Pharisee. And how did the Pharisees reason? Well, they reason like the people of the day. They would engage in a system of debate or argument known as the diatribe, diatribe, the diatribe. And it's kind of hard to explain that these days, because the word, like so often in language, or so often with language rather, words take on meanings over the course of time that it's not exactly precise in the way that it meant in the way back then, like now. So for example, if I say to you that we're engaged in a cult, right, in the truest sense of the word, that is actually accurate, because the word cult has to do with service. It has to do with culture. That's where the word culture comes from the word cult. Did you know that? It has to do with, so we're engaged in a culture of service to Almighty Yahweh, and that word cult. Why don't we say that though? Why don't we say that we're engaged in a cult? Because we look like a bunch of, right, fanatics. Because in our day and age, the word cult has a different connotation. It has a connotation, a negative connotation, obviously, because of the ways in which that term has been used. But the word cult is an accurate term. And we could think of half a dozen. The word graffiti. The word graffiti, that scholars use the word graffiti. They'll look at words, they'll look at the writings, the scratchings in the walls that they find, or in clay, baked clay, and they say, oh, and the actual technical term that they use is graffiti. Now, we think graffiti, we think what, the big cities, the urban environments, you spray paint stuff, right? But the word graffiti is accurate. We talk about the word autographs, the original autographs, the original writings that were found in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, and they're called the autographs. But we think of an autograph, we think, hey, you're getting Brad Pitt to sign your thing, right? So words, you got to look at the context in which they're written. The word diatribe is the same thing. The word diatribe has to do with a system of argument where you ask a question and you wait for an answer. So you'll see throughout the book of Romans, Paul will say, so well, what does that mean? Does that mean that the law is done away with? Well, no, but we established the law. And so, should we continue to do evil so that grace may abound, as some people say? Well, clearly not. That's absurd, right? And he gives us his own answer, right? That's the system of the diatribe. And I emphasize all that, and I take so much time to explain that, because you want to understand that there's, in the context of the book of Romans, that there's more going on here. This is not just some letter he wrote down to a friend of his, a personal friend that he's going. He is laying forth throughout the entire book a system of argument to make a legal case, to build a legal case, so that he can solidify so many of the positions that he takes in the Messiah, and make it understandable and firm for the people who's hearing this. And like always in Paul's writings, we're not familiar with all of the exact issues of the day that he was responding to. So we have to glean that from the text. We have to, extract that from the text. But what's happening here, obviously, is there's like there was in Galatia, there is a push and pull here between Jew and Gentile. And it seems apparent that you had some Jewish believers who were at odds with Gentile believers. And also you have to understand historically what's happening. Jews have just started to come back to Rome because under Claudius, they were exiled from Rome. They were sent away from Rome. And then after Claudius's death, they were brought back to Rome. So by this time, you have Gentile believers who are not used to dealing with Jewish believers. And all of a sudden, now you have all these Jewish people. And then, of course, the Jewish people are saying, well, these are Gentiles who don't know anything about the Torah. They don't know what they're talking about. And they don't know anything about circumcision. And this is this constant push and pull. Never underestimate that context, that undercurrent that's going through the book. So Paul is making an argument, right? So he's saying here, okay, so you, and almost certainly he's referring, because of the context of the entire chapter, he's referring to Jewish believers in this context here. So you have no excuse, anyone, whoever you are, who sit in judgment. Why would a Jew be sitting in judgment over a Gentile? Well, because we have the Torah, you see. And because, these Gentiles, they don't know what they're talking about, because, they don't have the law like we do. But then he says, when you judge someone else, you condemn yourself, because you who are behaving as a judge are doing the same things. So he starts off in chapter 1 talking about everybody, Jew and Gentile, that has started to go off the deep end with regard to idolatry. And history bears that forth. And he's going to describe that going forward. So he's trying to say, before he even gets to chapter 2, he's already laying the foundation, saying, hey, the whole world has sinned, essentially, he has said. Everyone, humanity, Jew and Gentile, has fallen under sin with a capital S. And now he starts going more specifically. Hey, you guys who are putting on so many airs about I'm a Jew, how are you behaving? If you who sit in judgment and judge someone else, you got to be careful with what measure you're using, because whatever measure you use, Yahshua said, that measure is going to be used for you, right? Yahweh's judgment falls, we know, in accordance with the truth on those who do such things, the kind of things that the Gentiles presumably are doing. But if you judge those who do them, and yet you do them yourself, do you really suppose that you will escape Yahweh's judgment? No, right? Because you're the first one who's supposed to be doing the right thing. Or do you despise the riches of Elohim's kindness, forbearance, and patience? Don't you know that Yahweh's kindness is meant to bring you to repentance? But by your hard, unrepentant heart, Jewish person, you are building up a store of anger for yourself on the day of anger, the day when Yahweh's just judgment will be unveiled. The Elohim who will repay everyone according to their works, everyone, Jew and Gentile. And then he says, when you do what's good, when you're pursuing the glory and honor that you were meant to have, Yahweh is going to give you life of the age to come. And by the way, that age to come, we don't have a lot of time to spend on it, but you may see in some versions, and let me just take a look at the other versions that we have here. So just bear with me a minute as I bring that up. Okay, that's verse 7. Okay. Yeah. So let me bring that up on screen for you. Excuse me. So if you look at here in the NASB, verse 7, to those who by perseverance in doing good, excuse me, seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life, aionios zoe. Well, this term eternal life, right? We tend to think of that as eternal life, living forever. The actual term, wow. The actual term means the age to come, because the Jewish people viewed two different ages, right? There's the present age, and then there's the age to come. Now, I fully believe that age to come is one that is describing ultimately, on the basis of a number of different passages, it is referring to ultimately going into eternity, but you can't get that from this term, just so you're aware of that. This term eternal life means the age to come. It's, and I forget the Hebrew term that it's equivalent to, but it means there's this age and as the age to come, where the people get their reward, etc. So just a little aside there. So he says, but when people act out of selfish desire and do not obey the truth, right? Instead, if you're obeying wickedness, injustice, there'll be anger and fury, trouble and distress for every person who does what is wicked, the Jew first and also equally the Greek. And then if you do what's right, you will see glory, right? Everyone, Jew first and also the Greek. Elohim, you see, shows no partiality. Now, he starts going a little deeper into the argument. Everyone, verse 12, everyone who sinned outside the law, you see, will be judged outside the law. And those who sin from within the law will be judged by means of the law. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about Jew and Gentile. He's talking about the standard of judgment by which each of these will be judged. So everyone who sinned outside the law, in other words, Gentiles, people of the nations, Greeks, barbarians, right? Everyone who sinned outside the law. Why outside the law? Because they didn't have it. They hadn't heard the law. They'll be judged outside the law. In other words, they won't be judged by the standard of the law. But those who sin from within the law, in other words, those who had the Torah, the Jewish people, will be judged by means of the law, using the law. So he's establishing this distinction that everyone recognizes up to this point. Jews have Torah, Gentiles don't. After all, it isn't those who hear the law who are in the right before Elohim. It is those who do the law who will be declared to be in the right. So, declared to be in the right, that term has to do with the term righteousness, right? Or justified. Okay. So if you would look at, and I'm not going to keep going back and forth because it's going to be too disruptive, but if you're looking at the NASB, it's going to say that same verse in verse 13, for it is not the hearers of the law who are just before Elohim, but the doers of the law will be justified, right? So is that term enough? So anytime you see here this term of, it isn't those who hear the law who are in the right. So Professor Wright will always use the term in the right or something similar to that, put right or in the right. This is the term justified. It is those who do the law who will be declared to be in the right. The reason he says that, as I said, will become clearer when we look at chapters 3 and 4, but it is a legal terminology where that term justified, that term righteousness has to do with being declared right by a judge. Okay. So this is how it works out. So he's saying, before we go to verse 14, he's trying to show that Gentiles will be judged. Ultimately, Jew and Gentile are being judged by the same standard, except that in the case of the Jews, that has been expressed up to this point, that has been expressed through their keeping of the Torah, a Torah which was given to them by Elohim as a special people commended with a special purpose. So he says in verse 14, this is how it works out. Gentiles don't possess the law as their birthright, right? Because that's Israelites do, right? So he uses the term Jew because by this time, of course, the Jews are representative of all of Israel, okay? So I know that there's a distinction prophetically and a distinction in terms of promises that were made specifically to the Jews as compared to promises made to all of Israel, but we're not going to go into that here, and it's not really relevant. So whenever he says Jew, of course, by this time in the first century Common Era, we're talking about the Jews as representatives, because Israel by that time, the 10 northern tribes had been absorbed into Assyria and beyond, and then the southern tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and I think part of Simeon and Levi, they became the Jews. And then there were also elements from the other 10 tribes. People say all the time that they were lost. Well, that's problematic terminology. There were many from the tribes of Israel that came into the south, and then collectively they came to be known as the Jews or Jews. Okay, so when he talks about Jews, he's talking about Israel. Right? So, and the promises that were made to Israel as embodied by the Jews as the representatives at this time in history. So he's saying that the Gentiles don't possess the law as their birthright. The Jews did, right? But whatever they do, the Gentiles, whatever they do, whenever they do what the law says, they are a law for themselves, despite not possessing the law. So they don't possess the Torah, but when they do the things that the Torah says is right, then they're acting just like in the way that they're supposed to act. They show, verse 15, he goes on to further explain that. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their conscience bears witness as well. And their thoughts will run this way and that, sometimes accusing them, sometimes excusing, on the day when, according to the gospel I proclaim, Elohim judges all human secrets through King Yahshua. So what is he saying? He's saying that that whether you're Jew or whether you're Gentile, you're being judged by the same standard ultimately, because even Gentiles do by nature the things of the law that are already written on their hearts. I was just explaining to someone, I have a person that I mentor, and I was explaining to the individual today just this, that, matter of fact, using this text, that with regard to the context of our discussion had to do with what's happening with people who never knew Yahweh and who never, were exposed to the scriptures or didn't have, doctrines that we were familiar with, etc. And I said that Yahweh is going to judge them. I always I always use Romans 2 as the foundational text by which to base my belief that everyone is going to be judged according to their conscience if they don't have exposure to the Torah, and that a decision is being made well above my pay grade about who is saved and who is not saved. Because, people get I don't know how long you've been in the faith and how many things you've heard over the years, but I've been in this for, between 30 and 35 years, maybe more at this point, actually, maybe closer to 40. And and you'd be amazed how self-righteous people get about something like this. Religious, Bible-believing people, right? That this one's going to be saved, but this one isn't going to be saved, and that one's not going to be saved, and this one didn't use the name, so that one won't be saved, and this one didn't know, he said Jesus, so he's not going to be saved, and this one, didn't believe in the Torah, so that one's not going to be saved, and this one, and I'm thinking to myself, you need to stop that, okay? Because those decisions are being made above your pay grade. Let's become, and I've said this several times, and you're going to hear me say it over and over again, because this is one of my goals, one of my missions is through my teaching, is to use the pulpit that Yahweh has given me to try to affect a change in attitude and thinking among the worshipers. We need to no longer think in ways that are exclusivist. It's me and him. It's us versus them. And this has nothing to do with taking a stand for Yahweh. This has to do with all of us being human beings created in the image of Almighty Yahweh, and us all trying to find a way to him. Okay, how is that going to best be accomplished? So this self-righteous thing where that people got going as well, they're deciding that this one's going to be saved, but this isn't. That's not up to us to make that decision. Yahweh's going to do that, because Yahweh's the only one who knows the hearts. Okay, so the people who have a conscience, who have all they have is their conscience, what happens? The Torah is in everybody's heart. Why do I say that? Because we're created in the image of Elohim. What does that mean? It means that we're created with this, the breath of life that Yahweh gives us and the intellect that Almighty Yahweh gives us. That intellect is already infused, if you will, for lack of a better term, is infused with a sense of morality. That's part of who we are. That's part of what makes us human beings different from the animals, right? That we have it's not just rationality. We have the ability to rationalize. Yes, that's a great part of it, but we also have the ability to moralize, to recognize the difference between right and wrong. An animal don't care, right? When animals killing another animal, they're killing usually because they're hungry and they're going to eat. And that's all that they know, or because they're defending themselves. They're not thinking, is this right or wrong? Does this one have children? Does this one have? They're not thinking that, right? We think that way, rightfully so, because we're made in the image of Elohim. So we're imbued, if you will, with that sense of morality, that sense of justice. Or we understand things like beauty and love, right? And instinctively, we understand those things, because we're created in his image and we have his character, and he is those things. So therefore we have it as well. So what Paul is saying, I believe in chapter 2 there, is that whether you're given the law to spell it out for you, right? Spell out, book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus 23, and right, whether you're given that or not is immaterial, because everyone instinctively understands things about the Torah, the primary things. For example, I would dare say that every culture, and you always have aberrations. Don't point out the exceptions. In this culture they do this, and I don't care. That's an exception to the rule, right? The rule is, and I believe that if you did actual research on this, you'll find this to be true. That every culture knows instinctively, for example, that it's wrong to murder somebody. Now, some of them might find ways to justify it culturally or whatever, but everyone knows instinctively as a people that murder is wrong. Most people know that taking someone else's property is wrong. There's just something that says there's something wrong with this. Most people will know that there's something wrong with taking another person's wife, or or stealing someone's child, or a sense of fairness or a sense of justice. That's imbued in all of humanity because it's part of who we are. It's woven into our moral fabric and DNA. So Gentiles, getting back to Romans, know these things, and they're going to do these things. So you and I both know people that use the name of Yahweh and that use the name of Yahshua and treat other people like trash. And if you've never met someone like that, bless you, because we're not going to name names, but we all know people like that. You're telling me that individual, because they use the name of Yahweh, the name of Yahshua, that person is going to be saved, but the person who uses other names and titles, but yet treats people like the salt of the earth and feeds the poor and takes care of the hungry and those who need clothing, etc. You're telling me that those individuals don't have an opportunity for salvation simply because they didn't use the name or because they believed in this doctrine or that doctrine? I have to seriously disagree with you if you feel that. Yahweh's going to judge everyone. First of all, that's not a decision for us to make. So let's get out of the business of deciding who is saved and who is not saved, right? It's enough to deal with our own salvation. What does Paul say? To work out, Peter, to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, right? Whose salvation are you supposed to be working on? The guy next to you? Your salvation, right? It's enough to deal with our own selves. Let's get out of the business of deciding for other people. But anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on that one. But the important thing to understand here in Romans is that people, whether they have the Torah or don't or not, they're still going to be judged on the basis of their conscience, on what they are doing with that ingrained conscience that Almighty Yahweh has given them. Okay, and there's a point why he's saying all this, and that'll become clearer as we go through this. So he's saying they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. So he's kind of saying, and I'll give you a little preview of that. He's kind of saying, don't be so proud of yourselves because you have the Torah. It's like the people in Jeremiah's day that they were saying, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh. As long as you have this great grand temple, then that must mean that, Yahweh will always be with us, and we'll never forget that we're committing idolatry, forget that we're treating our neighbors, our neighbors terrible, that we're taking our neighbor's wife, and that we're cheating people and whatever. As long that we're doing idolatry in secret, right? Forget all those things. The temple of Yahweh is here. So you know what Yahweh finally does? He removes his spirit from the temple of Yahweh, and eventually it comes down in pieces. So much for the temple of Yahweh. See, the temple of Yahweh is not that building, you understand. And then guess what? That was in regarding Solomon's temple. And then they created a new temple, which is the one that eventually, became known as Herod's temple. And that one came down in 72, in Common Era 70, right? But they did the same thing with that one too. His grand temple, and Yahshua says to the disciples, in effect, don't be so proud of this temple. Well, look at this gorgeous temple. Don't be so proud of this temple, right? There's not going to be, I tell you that there's not going to be one stone left unturned in short order. And sure enough, by 70, that temple was completely destroyed and burned through and through, because the temple building is nothing. It is the actual temple that is being built, the temple not made with hands, the temple made by individuals who love Yahweh, who reflect his glory, so that his actual spirit can be with us and reside with us, because his spirit will reside in the midst of holiness, not in the midst of corruption, you see. So anyway, so going back to this, he's saying, don't be so proud on, that you have the Torah and that you call yourself a Jew. But supposing you call yourself a Jew, verse 17, supposing you rest your hope in the law, supposing you celebrate the fact that Yahweh is your Elohim, right? And that you know what he wants. See, you know what he wants, all right? And that by the law's instruction, you can make appropriate moral distinctions. Supposing you believed yourself to be a guide to the blind, a light to people in darkness, a teacher of the foolish, an instructor for children, all because in the law, you possess the outline of knowledge and truth. And by the way, as we go through this, you'll see he doesn't really disagree with that, because I believe he believes it himself. He does believe that the Jewish people are a guide to the blind, a light to people in darkness, a teacher of the foolish, an instructor for children, etc., and that it helps you make appropriate moral distinctions. However, his point is going to be not that none of that is true, but that you're acting in ways that invalidates all of that. If you believe those things, but you don't act that way, then what good is believing in it or saying that you believe in it? Well then, verse 21, if you're going to teach someone else, aren't you going to teach yourself? Start there. Didn't Joshua say the same thing when he talked about taking the beam out of your own eye before you try to take the speck out of someone else's? If you say people shouldn't steal, do you steal? If you say people shouldn't commit adultery, do you commit adultery? If you loathe idols, do you rob temples? And people did that in those days. They robbed temples. If you boast in the law, do you dishonor Yahweh by breaking the law? This is what the scripture says. Because of you, Yahweh's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles. Absolutely. Then he goes on further and he says, circumcision, you see, has real value for people who keep the law. Why? Because circumcision implies that you are in fact a law keeper, right? So let me stop this here and let's just look at that, because we don't have a lot of time to go through that. And it's actually a deeper issue in Galatians and explained much deeper in the book of Galatians and in the book of Acts. But circumcision is a representation of something. You'll see that in chapter 4 as well when he talks about Abraham. Okay. But if you look at, let's say Deuteronomy, and I'm just kind of pulling these out of my head, so just be with me for a minute. Okay. Bear with me for a minute. Deuteronomy 10, let's start with verse 12 for context. Deuteronomy 10:12. Can everyone see that? Again, I can't see you, and my normal partner is not here to give me a thumbs up. So I'm assuming you see that. So it says, "Now Israel, what does Yahweh your Elohim require from you, but to fear Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep Yahweh's commandments and his statutes, which I'm commanding you today for your good." In other words, all the things Paul says, right? Are you keeping all these things that you say you're believing? "Behold, to Yahweh your Elohim belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did Yahweh set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day." And then key verse 16, "So circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer." Circumcise your heart. What does that mean, circumcise your heart? It means that true circumcision is not a physical act that a male does on his foreskin, to put it bluntly. Circumcision is a heart thing. What is it that Abraham went through with circumcision? It was an outward representation. What does Yahweh describe that? Let's see what he says about that, and we'll come back to circumcision in another verse as well. But let's see, because we're going to come back to this later anyway, in Genesis. When Abram was 99 years old, right? He says in verse 7, "I will establish my covenant between me and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant." So that's important. He tells Abraham, "I'm going to establish a covenant with you, to be Elohim to you and to your descendants after you." Okay. "I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their Elohim." Elohim said further to Abraham, "Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be." So we think that circumcision itself was the covenant. It was not. Circumcision was not. You have to read the whole thing, the whole context. The covenant itself was not circumcision. Circumcision was the outward representation of an inward condition. It was the outward representation of the covenant. How do I know that? Because it tells you, verse 11, "And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of the foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you." The circumcision is not the covenant itself, it's the sign of it. "Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations," etc., etc. "Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh, that person shall be cut off from his people," etc. Okay. So what happens to the females? Well, they're not circumcised, so therefore they can't be part of the covenant, right? No, wrong. right? The male is representative of the, the household of the family. So in that cultural context, if the male is circumcised and the rest of the family is following what the male says, which presumably was the case, then everybody's circumcised, right? But the male bears in his flesh, in this cultural context, the sign of the covenant, the seal and the sign, as Paul puts it. But the covenant itself was not the circumcision. The covenant was this promise that Yahweh had given to Abraham. You got to go before this, right? Verse 7, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. That is the covenant. What did he just told him? He says down up in the very beginning, when Abram, this is 17 verse 1, now when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. Walk before me and be blameless. Right? So it's conditional. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and Elohim talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, father of multitudes, or father of Av is father, Raham is like it's a multitude. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations, plural of you, and kings will come forth from you. And this is an expansion of what he said to him all the way back in Genesis 12. Now, Yahweh, when he first calls him, Yahweh said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. You, Abram, you shall be a blessing. What does that mean? You shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, you shall be a blessing. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. All the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abram is called to be the progenitor of a group of descendants through whom the entire earth will be blessed. And of course, we know that from Abram came Isaac, and from Isaac came Jacob, who was called Israel. And Israel was then to continue the witness to the nations, to be a blessing to the nations. What is Yahweh doing here? What he's doing is he's reversing the curse of Adam. So he tells Adam, he says, be fruitful and multiply. And Adam fails in his responsibility, and he merits death, but Yahweh shows him grace instead and gives a messianic promise that's going to be fulfilled in the future. So Genesis 11, of course, is the record of the Tower of Babel, where you have multitudes of nations coming together, trying to do things in their own way to reach Yahweh. And Yahweh says, nope, it's not going to be done your way. It's going to be done my way. So what does he do? He scatters them throughout the earth. And then in Genesis 12, he starts it all over again through Abram, a righteous man who believes in him. And we'll see it's reckoned to him, it's accounted to him as righteousness. So what he's doing is he's reversing the story, he's reversing the story of failed Adam through Abram and his family. So he says to Adam, be fruitful and multiply, and it doesn't come to pass. So now he tells to Abram, guess what? I'm going to multiply you. What was supposed to happen to Adam, I'm going to do it through you. Like always, Yahweh's taking matters into his own hands. Says, I will bless you, and I will make you a blessing. And multitude, kings are going to come from you, he says in Genesis 17. There's so much going on here. And again, I see it's 6:10 already. I need to speed it up because we're still in chapter 2, right? But you see how easily you could just go from place to place here? And we're going to come back to Genesis 15 later, but tell you what, let's do that. Let's come back to Genesis 15 later. But let's go back to this concept of circumcision, right? So, by the way, all of that happens before Abraham is circumcised, right? Only in Genesis 17 is he finally circumcised. He's 99 years old. So what does that mean? That circumcision is anything terribly important? No. He was faithful before he was circumcised. He was circumcised because he was faithful, not the other way around. He wasn't faithful because he was circumcised. He was circumcised because he was faithful. Because circumcision only became the sign of the covenant. But the covenant was already in his heart, right? It was already established. Yahweh said, this is what I'm going to do for you because of your faithfulness to me. From faithfulness to faithfulness. Back and forth exchange. You're faithful to me, Abraham. I'm faithful to you. That's how our covenant works. In our day, we don't have covenants like that, right? But we have something called contracts, agreements, service agreements or contracts. Same thing. You do this and I'll do this back. You break this, you lose the benefits of the covenant, right? We don't call it covenants, but that's what they are. We don't call them oaths. We call them affirmations, or sometimes we call them oaths, right? If you're in a court of law, you call it an oath, and on, okay? But one more verse about circumcision. And by the way, I'm actually kind of responding to chapter 4, as well as I'm going through this, so it'll save me some time later. But if you look also at Deuteronomy 30, so we looked at Deuteronomy 10, but also Deuteronomy 30, which says what? Verse 6, moreover, Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants, to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. That is what circumcision is. Circumcision is loving Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul. This is why there is no male, there is no female, because it's not dependent on the physical act of circumcision. This was the heartburn that Paul had in Acts 15 and Galatians, right, about circumcision, is that people were, you got to be a Jew in order to be acceptable before Almighty Yahweh, which means you got to get circumcised and you got to keep all this oral law minutia, right? And Paul is saying, no, you need to stop making this distinction between Jew and Gentile, because Yahweh is trying to do something different. He's trying to bring us all together as one people. He's trying to reverse the curse of Babylon and bring us all together as one. Now, we can debate later about the law in general, if he's talking only about oral law. Like I said last week, I don't believe he's just referring to oral law. I think he's also referring to all the Torah, including the written Torah, but I don't believe it's in the way that Christianity teaches it. I believe that there are interpretations, the ways in which that written Torah was being interpreted, that were making distinctions between Jew and Gentile, that was killing their relationship and killing their dedication to Almighty Yahweh because of the stringency of it. So that's a debate for another day. I don't even want to go there because there's just no time for that with this. Okay, but understand where the concept of circumcision is coming from. When I'm within accordance, if I go to different tabs, does it show it goes back and forth? Okay, so it's only within that window then. All right. So going back to, I have to stop because I got to go back to the Kindle. Okay, so he's saying, verse 25, circumcision, you see, has real value for people who keep the law. If, however, you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. You see that? Because circumcision is not the deal. It's your obedience. It's your loving Yahweh, you see. So if people who don't have the Torah, right, they don't have the Torah in their hands, they've never heard of it, or they don't know how to keep it, if they're still doing the things, treating their neighbor right, loving their neighbor, right, etc., if they're doing those things, and you're robbing temples and committing adultery and doing all kinds of foolishness that the law says in print that you're not supposed to do, see Yahshua, I can see Yahshua's finger writing on the ground in John 8. As everyone's already, stones ready in hand to stone the woman. The man's long gone, nowhere to be found. Maybe he's even among the crowd, but they're waiting there with stones ready to destroy this woman's life. And Yahshua's writing on the ground, right? If uncircumcision, meanwhile, verse 26, if uncircumcised people keep the law's requirements, their uncircumcision will be regarded as circumcision, won't it? So people who are by nature uncircumcised, Gentiles, but who fulfill the law, thereby making them truly circumcised, this is the parenthetical here, will pass judgment on people like you who possess the letter of the law and circumcision, but who break the law. Because, and he kind of sums it up here in verse 28, the Jew isn't the person who appears to be one, you see, nor is circumcision what it appears to be, a matter of physical flesh. The Jew is the one in secret. And I think the one in secret is, I think in secret is probably not the best. I wouldn't agree with that translation. I think the one who does things behind the scenes, maybe, right? And circumcision is a matter of the heart. We just saw that in Deuteronomy 30 and Deuteronomy 10, in the spirit rather than the letter. Such a person gets praise, not from humans, but from Yahweh, right? Because he's doing the things of the law. So that person is truly circumcised. So what's this all about? Is he saying, Jews, you're a bunch of bad people? And what? No, no, no. He's responding to somebody's argument, right? That we are Jews because we have the law and we're superior, and the Gentiles this and the Gentiles that. And Paul he's just about had it up to here with both the Galatians and with the Romans. And he's saying, stop. If we're going to become the kind of people that Almighty Yahweh wants to represent him, then we have to stop with these distinctions between Jew and Gentile. Because what they're doing is they're causing a division, a separation between us. Division is not the way of Yahweh. Division is the way of Babylon, right? That's what happened over at the Tower of Babylon, that because of them, they trying to do things in their own way, sort of what you see in chapter 1 of Romans, Yahweh gave them up to their own passions and said, you go. You want to do it your way? You go, but you're not going to do it on my watch. And he divided them. He disrupted their language so that their languages wouldn't be the same, right? Because he wasn't going to make it easy for them. But now Paul is trying to reverse that. So he's making a larger issue. And remember, in all this, he's building a case. He's not just speaking to individual Jews. He's talking about the Jewish people as a whole. And he's trying to make a larger case that, okay, you had a responsibility as a Jew to do certain things. And it's clear, like we saw in chapter 1, that not even you have been able to do it. So where does that leave us? Well, he's going to tell us where that leaves us. But first, he continues in chapter 3. What advantage then does the Jew possess? What indeed is the point of circumcision? So circumcision was, not necessary anyway. The Jews were not necessary. No. This is where he goes against the people who say, well, then let's put aside those old Jews and that old Jewish law and all that. No. Paul is a proud Jew, right? You see that in several instances in Philippians and in Corinthians and elsewhere. He's a proud Jew. And he believes that the Jewish people were meant to be witnesses. So that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that let's cast the Jews aside and right. And what people have used over centuries to bring anti-Semitic tropes against the Jews. We're not going to go there. That's not the point of these writings at all. He's trying to say, okay, what advantage did they possess? What indeed is the point? A great deal in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with Elohim's oracles. So by oracles is an interesting word, by the way. That word oracles, we don't usually think about that in terms of the word of Yahweh. We think of oracles. Whenever I hear the word oracle, I just automatically, because of my conditioning, I think of the Oracle of Delphi, right? Which is a Greek oracle that they would go and consult. So I'm not crazy about the word oracle, but it is an accurate term. An oracle is what? An oracle is the pronouncements of the messages of the Elohim to whom the oracles belong. So he's saying the Jews were entrusted with these oracles. So what does that mean? Well, we normally traditionally interpret that as that the Jews were given the Torah, right? And I believe that that's accurate, right? But it's more than that. It's not just that they were given the word. It's not just that they were given the Torah. It's that they were given a message to convey to the rest of humankind, to the rest of the nations, a la Genesis 12, a la Genesis 15, 17. So what does the word entrusted mean? So people will read that and say, well, the Jews were given the Torah and blah, and they just go on. No. Let's be a little bit more careful here. What does the word entrusted mean? Entrusted means something specific. Don't just fly over language, but see what it means. When you have something entrusted, you are given something in trust. So people will look at that. The Jews are entrusted. They were given the Torah. So that old Torah was that old Jewish law just for the Jews, and everybody else had their own thing. And that's how you get misunderstandings and misconceptions. That is absolutely precisely what it's not saying, that Torah was for the Jews and then the Gentiles did whatever they did. No. He says the Jews were entrusted with Elohim's oracles. When you're entrusted with something, is that for you? Who is that for? It's for whomever you are entrusted with that thing for. If someone gives you $500,000, right? May it be. May you be blessed. May you be so blessed. If someone gives you $500,000 and they say to put it in a trust for for your underage son who's, 8 years old, what does that mean? To put it in trust. In trust, INTRUST. It means that you put it in an account. It's allocated, it's assigned to, yes, but more specifically, it's put into an account on behalf of that child. And then when that child becomes of age, which typically, at least here in the US, is 18, then that child receives those funds and they can do whatever they want with them. Is that not so? So when you entrust the word entrust, ENT, it means that. It means in trust. If I entrust a letter to you to read to your congregation, what am I doing? Is the letter for me? The letter is for your congregation. I'm entrusting it to you. Is it for you? It's not for you alone anyway. It's for you to hold in trust on behalf of your congregation. So for the Jews to have been entrusted with oracles, it wasn't just for them. On the contrary, it was for the people to whom they were sent. Who were they sent to? The entire world. They were witnesses to the whole world. You think it's any coincidence that Satan has acted in the course of history with hatred to the Jews, to stir up hatred towards the Jews? Of course, because you want to kill the messenger, literally. Think about it. The vitriol and absolute hatred towards the Jews and all of human experience. That's not a coincidence. That is a direct attack of the adversary, who knows that if the Jews fulfilled their mission, boy, the earth would be filled with the glory of Almighty Yahweh. We can't have that, can we? So what do? You kill the messenger. And if you can't kill the messenger directly, which he has done in many ways through historical persecution, what do? You have them, you instigate, and you accuse, so that people, and you begin to stir trouble, so that from the inside, it rots from the inside out. And both things have happened over the years. So Paul is saying, it's like a thing of, it's a thing of great concern, right? He says, pulled up the wrong one, sorry. It's actually quite a compliment, right? I did it again. Okay. He says, so what advantage did you have? Well, he said, a great deal in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with Yahweh's oracles. You had the message. What follows from that? If some of them were unfaithful to their commission, does their unfaithfulness nullify Yahweh's faithfulness? Certainly not. You see the diatribe? Does their unfaithfulness nullify? No, of course not. He gives the question and the answer, right? It's like a way of driving the point home. So he's saying what? So does it mean that because many of the Jewish people did not fulfill their commission, that the commission itself was wrong? No, the commission wasn't wrong. People failed it, but the commission itself wasn't wrong. Certainly not. Let Elohim be true, and every human being false, as the Bible says, so that you may be found in the right in what you say, and may win the victory when you come to court. That's from Psalm 51, David speaking, right? So that you may be found, you Yahweh may be found in the right in what you say, you may be justified in what you say, is what most translations say, and may win the victory when you come to court. And I want to keep my Bible handy so that I can read some of these without going back and forth. That would be, as I said, Psalm 51, verse 4. Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So the context in which David says this is, hey, I've sinned, but does my sin mean that your law is wrong? No, it means I'm wrong, right? I failed. Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict. I love how the NIV puts this here. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. There's the legal concept. But if our being wrong, our being in the wrong proves that Elohim is in the right, what are we going to say? That Elohim is unjust to inflict anger on people? I'm reducing things to a human scale. So he's bringing up some of the arguments that people in his day would bring against him, and he's saying, I'm going to speak like them for the moment. So if being in the wrong proves that Elohim is right, what are we going to say? That Elohim is unjust, right? He's unjust to inflict anger on people. He's unjust because, well, that's just the way things are happening. He said, I'm reducing things to human scale. Certainly not. You know better than that, he's saying. How then could Elohim judge the world? He couldn't judge the world if he was unjust, right? But if Yahweh's truthfulness shows all the greater and brings him glory in and through my falsehood, this is what people were saying about him, that he was false. Why am I still being condemned as a sinner? Can't have it both ways. If you say that I'm being false, remember, we don't know all the things he was responding to, but we know that his credibility was often coming into question with naysayers and gainsayers against him. So he's responding to these attacks on his character. If Elohim's truthfulness shows all the greater and brings him glory in and through my falsehood, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? Why don't you just accept it and say, hey, see, that's Paul is proof that Elohim is unjust. And he goes further, and why not do evil so that good may come, as some people blasphemously say about us, and as some allege that we say. So even in his own day, right, people were condemning him as someone who was saying, do evil so that good may come. And we see proof of that. You look in Acts chapter 21. Remember, James and his people said, Paul, there are people who are saying that you're teaching against the Torah. So do me a favor, go over to the temple right now and finish your vow. At that time, he was in a vow of like a Nazarite vow type of thing. He said, go there, fulfill the requirements of the temple so that you could show people that you're keeping the Torah. Remember that in Acts 21? You can look it up later. We don't have time to go there. But people were saying, even in his day, right? Even Peter said, just be careful in how you interpret the words of Paul, because some people who are unlearned are twisting those things around, trying to make them mean what and I'm paraphrasing heavily, right? But that's what he's saying, that they're trying to twist Paul's writings. So Paul was experiencing things in his own day. He says, why not do evil so that good may come, as some people blasphemically say about us, and as some allege that we say? People like that at least deserve the judgment they get. So Paul he's trying to explain the advantage of being a Jew. But then there's a greater point, right? What then? Are we in fact better off? No, certainly not. I have already laid down this charge, you see. Jews as well as Greeks are all under the power of sin, capital S, right? So do you see how that convention of sin with a capital S helps to keep framing things, right? It's like, are we better off? So he's saying, yeah, we there are definite advantages to being a Jew, because it's true. We did receive these charges, but on the ground, what's happening on the ground all these years? Are we in fact better off? In other words, are we better off than the Gentiles? Not really, right? Because I've already established that, because we're all sinning. We didn't fulfill the thing like we were supposed to do. Jews as well as Greeks are all, sorry, you have the Torah, but sorry, you're not inoculated against sin. Because your life and the proof of history shows that you've been sinning as much as the Greeks, if not more than the Greeks. Jews as well as Greeks are all, so in other words, don't be so proud. This is what the scripture says, and then he uses a biblical example, right? No one is in the right, nobody at all. So where's that come from? So that is coming from the prophets, right? So I'm going to find the specific verse for you here. We're making good progress here, so hang in there. Sorry, did I say the prophets? It's actually Psalm 14, verses 1-3. So no one is in the right, nobody at all. No one understands or goes looking for Elohim. All of them alike have wandered astray. Together they have all become futile. None of them behaves kindly, no, not one. So if you go to Psalm 14, and I won't turn there, verses 1-3, this is what it says. I'll just read it to you. The fool says in his heart, there is no Elohim. They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. Yahweh looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand and who seek Elohim. All have turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Okay. And then he continues reading, their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The poison of vipers is under their lips. So that's Psalm 5, verse 9, and Psalm 140, verse 3. If you're writing these down, Psalm 5, verse 9, Psalm 140, verse 3. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are quick when there's blood to be shed. Disaster and wretchedness are in their paths, and they did not know the way of peace. They have no fear of Elohim before their eyes. So this is Isaiah 59, and that's kind of what I was thinking before, but I jumped the gun. Isaiah 59, 7-8, and verse 18, that was through 17, and then verse 18, there is no fear of Elohim before their eyes, Psalm 36, 1. And Paul is just kind of spouting these things off, right? The man was a walking encyclopedia, no? So he's using all this to show, look, This is talking about all humanity, not just Gentiles. Yeah, that includes you too, Jews, right? So no one here can boast over the other. Verse 19, now we know that whatever the law says, it is speaking to those who are in the law, because you have been given the law, right? The purpose of this is that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be brought to the bar of Yahweh's judgment. What is this talking about? Again, this is a legal concept. He's using legal language throughout all this. How do I know that? The purpose of this is that every mouth may be stopped. What is that? That's doing this. Right? Look at me if you're not looking at me, right? There's literally, right? Because in a court of law, if you have nothing to say in your defense, you cover your mouth, right? So you think about, and I'll just pull a couple of verses here. I'll have to look for them, so just bear with me. So the one that kind of prominently comes into my head is, let's see here. I need to look this one up, so just bear with me, okay? Job 40, verse 4. I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth, right? I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. There's another one that escapes me at the moment, but another place that you could think of is, for example, the Apostle Paul, when he's being questioned in front of the Sanhedrin, and he's saying, I'm not doing the things, and I'm paraphrasing, right? I'm not doing what you're accusing me of. The high priest does what? Do you remember what he does? He commands them to strike him in the mouth, right? So you might think, well, he's just, being mean and striking him, slapping him. Well, he is being mean and he is doing that, but it's a legal thing too, right? It's like basically you have nothing to say in your defense, so shut up, right? So he commands them to shut him up, essentially. It's a legal thing. So going back to chapter 3. So he says the purpose of this is that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be brought to the bar of Yahweh's judgment. What's that? The bar of Yahweh's judgment. Again, it's a legal term. What do we say even here in the United States about lawyers? Where are lawyers brought? Before the what? Before the bar, right? So you have the Professional Bar Association, right? You're being brought before the bar of Yahweh's judgment, a bar, because it brings a standard of judgment, right? So he's saying that I'm trying to, the point of all this is to make clear that both Jew and Gentile are in the wrong before Almighty Yahweh. So no one can open their mouth to defend themselves otherwise, because not one person is in the right. No mere mortal, verse 30, you see, can be declared to be in the right, to be justified before Elohim on the basis of the works of the law. What you get through the law is the knowledge of sin. Okay, there's a whole lot packed into that. We just don't have time to go into. So let's just move on. But now, quite apart from the law, and I will explain this in a minute, though the law and the prophets bore witness to it, Elohim's justice, his righteousness, his covenant justice has been displayed. Yahweh's righteousness, Yahweh's covenant justice comes into operation through the faithfulness of Yahshua the Messiah for the benefit of all who have faith. For there's no distinction. All sinned and fell short of Yahweh's glory. And by Yahweh's grace, they are freely declared to be in the right, to be members of the covenant through the redemption which is found in the Messiah, Yahshua. So now he's getting to the point of it all, right? To the main point of it all, which is what? He's saying, quite apart from the law, he's saying, let me go back to verse 20. No mere mortal, you see, no man can be declared to be in the right, can be justified And that term justified is, again, continuing the legal terminology. It's when a judge hears a case and declares for one or the other, he declares this person to be in the right. No one can be declared to be in the right before Elohim on the basis of the works of the law. And the main reason for that is because the law was not being kept the way that it should be kept. And because they were also doing things that were ritualistically based as compared to the true meaning of the law. What you get through the law is the knowledge of sin. So the law helped you to understand sin better, but it didn't help you apparently to keep it and to have salvation because you broke it. But now, quite apart from the law, though the law and the prophets bore witness to it, so there's nothing wrong with the law, there's nothing wrong with the prophets, and both of those things, the Torah and the Nevi'im, right? The Torah and the Nevi'im led you to what we're doing here, because both the law and the prophets spoke of Yahshua, spoke of Messiah, you see. But apart from the law, Yahweh's covenant justice has been displayed. How? What he's going to say now. How was Yahweh's righteousness displayed? How was his covenant justice displayed? Yahweh's covenant justice comes into operation. Here's how. Through the faithfulness of Yahshua the Messiah. What does that mean? The faithfulness of Yahshua the Messiah. It means through his righteousness, through his keeping of the Torah, through his fulfillment of everything that Yahweh required of him. And he's the only one that's done it, because everyone else was not right. Every mouth, no one is right. Nobody at all. All of them have wandered astray. They've all become futile, and the poison of vipers is on their lips, and they have deceit, etc. But Yahshua had no deceit, right? Yahshua was perfect in every way. So if you look at something like Matthew 5:17-20, it describes that. It describes how Yahshua was a perfect innocent who fulfilled his Father's will completely. And through his faithfulness, it was done. Yahweh's covenant justice, his righteousness, his justification for us, the term justification or righteousness comes for us through Yahshua the Messiah. And I want to be clear here, and this is going to become more clear as we go through this, that this is not a doctrine. There's a doctrine within Christianity which is known as imputation of righteousness. That is not what this is talking about. The doctrine of imputation essentially says this. It says that none of us are righteous. Yahshua the Messiah is the only righteous one, right? Because he did everything perfectly. So therefore, he has this morality that he somehow, he has this extra morality that he transfers to us. He imputes it. He transfers it to us. And therefore, that's how we're made righteous. That is not what this is saying at all. And I know that that's what the traditional teaching in Christianity is, but it's just not correct. It's not consistent with this legal concept that's being brought out here. Yahweh's covenant justice comes into operation through the faithfulness of Yahshua the Messiah for the benefit, we'll get to that a little bit more later, for the benefit of all who have faith, from faith to faith. Right? I keep going back to that. From faithfulness to faithfulness. So it's being done he did it for the benefit of all, Jew and Gentile, who have faith. For there is no distinction. All sinned and fell short of Yahweh's glory. And by the way, this fell short of Yahweh's glory is not just, this is one of those things where in the past we just, kind of zooms over ahead. He fell short of Yahweh's glory. Okay, we all sinned, therefore we fell short of Yahweh's glory because we sinned, and we move on, and we don't really explain that. No. There's something specific that's being talked about here. We fell short of Yahweh's glory. What does that mean? We fell short of Yahweh's glory. Well, we fell short of Yahweh's glory in the sense that I described it earlier, right? That his glory was with us, and because we failed him, his glory departed from us. So in that sense, we failed him, but also humanity in pursuing the forces, the elemental forces, the idolatry and all the things behind it, fell short of the commission that we were given to be his image. We literally fell short of being image bearers of Almighty Yahweh. Why? Because when you do those kind of things that were being described in chapter 1, you become less of a human being. You become less of a human being. I want this point to really sink in, because it's one of the things I want to drive through here. I'm not teaching theology here. I want you to understand, because this sounds like a really abstract concept, but it's not. It's understandable, but we got to let it sink in who we are, because it speaks directly to our identity. We are made in the image of Elohim. I just saw the other day someone who's explaining something, and I won't describe the context of what it was, but it's not important. But he's explaining, he's saying, and we human beings, this is a secular teaching. This is not a religious thing. And he's saying, and one of the problems that we have as human beings is we don't know why we're here. We're always trying to find why we're here and all that. And I thought to myself, I might have agreed with you on that, a few years ago, but I no longer agree with that. I know exactly why we're here. I know exactly why we're here. And you should know exactly why we're here as well. And you know what it is, because I've been talking about it for weeks now, and you probably knew before I even said it, right? We are here, and we say it, but it's just kind of like, woo, this concept out there. We are here to glorify Almighty Yahweh. That is what we are here for. We are here to promote his glory throughout the earth. That is why mankind is here. There is no mystery about why we're here. Now, how we manifest that in the day-to-day is, we can flesh that out, but there should be no mystery about that. We are here to be his image on the earth, to reflect his image on the earth. And we do that best by following his word and by acting in ways that are consistent with the way that Yahshua the Messiah acted, who was our primary example, right? So when you do things, when you choose to do things, when I choose to do things, when we choose to do things that are contrary to his word, not only do we dishonor him among the people with whom we do it, but we dishonor ourselves in his presence, right? Because we become less than human. By the way, I think I've explained this before, but let me say it again very clearly. Let me never ever hear someone say in response to an accusation about something that they're doing wrong, or pointing out that something they're doing, well, I'm only human. I'm only human. You hear that all the time, right? It's one of those things that we say and we just don't even think about it anymore, because, right? Don't ever let me hear you say that, because you're going to hear a mouthful from me. Because I'm going to say to you, my response to you is going to be, well, if you're only human, then you need to work triple to overcome this thing. Because if you're only human, then that's a compliment. That's not a crutch for you to hide behind. Well, I'm only human, so therefore I'm frail, and therefore no. If you are human, that means that you are an image bearer of Elohim. So if you are only human, consider that to be the highest compliment. Okay? If you're only human, be that much more diligent to show yourself to Almighty Yahweh in a way that is filled with honor, to give his glory on the earth. Only human is a compliment. That's not a crutch. That's not an insult. Okay? So we have to really think about that in a very different way. We are human beings. That is an honor to be human beings. Not because we're anything in and of ourselves, but because Almighty Yahweh made us to reflect his glory on the earth. Okay? All right. So going back to this here. So he's saying, all sinned and fell short of Yahweh's glory, and by Yahweh's grace, his unmerited kindness, they are freely declared to be in the right, to be members of the covenant through the redemption which is found in the Messiah Yahshua. So by Yahweh's grace, through the actions of Yahshua, all human beings are freely declared to be in the right, are freely justified, are declared to be in the right by the judge, to be members of the covenant through the redemption which is found in the Messiah Yahshua. So it's through him that we are declared to be innocent. Elohim put Yahshua forth as the place of mercy through faithfulness by means of his blood. What is the place of mercy? And I could see, I'm not going to finish this today. I'm not going to finish this. I tell you what I'm going to do, because I don't want to extend this to 3 weeks. So I'm just going to kind of read through this quickly in the next 15 minutes and be done by 7, but understanding that we're just scratching the surface. Okay. So, we're just going to have to approach this from maybe like a several part seminar or something or other in the future. But Elohim puts Yahshua forth as the place of mercy. What is the place of mercy? Well, that is the the mercy seat in the temple, right? In the tabernacle. He is the place of mercy. And you see this in the book of Hebrews. Yahweh put Yahshua forth as the place of mercy through faithfulness by means of his blood. Another thing we need to be a little bit more precise about is our understanding of the sacrificial system. So we have an idea of the sacrificial system as pertains to Yahshua, but not even going that far just yet, as the sacrifice is us taking an animal so that the animal takes upon itself the punishment that is due to us. Is that really a biblical concept? It's debatable, right? But the bigger issue, and we could talk about that more deeply another day. But the real main issue of the sacrifice was the issue of the covering over by blood. Because if you look at the way the sacrifices were done, the sacrifice was not technically done on the altar. It was, the animal was killed separately, at least for the sin offering. It was killed separately. And then what happened? Then the blood was poured on the altar, right? So if you look over in Leviticus, let's do that because that's kind of important. Let me stop this and share this. So let's look at a place like Leviticus 4. So all right, so Leviticus 4:27, and you can look at pretty much any section. If any member of the community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of Yahweh's commands, when they realize their guilt and the sin they have committed becomes known, they must bring as their offering for the sin they committed a female goat without defect. They are to lay their hand on the head of the sin offering. So the laying of the hand on the sin offering is like basically saying this animal is doing this in my place, right? It's going in my place. And they slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering. So they slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering. But the place of the burnt offering, it doesn't say you slaughter it on the altar. It says you slaughter it at the place of the burnt offering. Then the priest is to take some of the blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering and pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar, etc., etc. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them and they will be forgiven. So what's my point about that? Is that the animal's not being necessarily killed on the altar. What's happening is the animal is being slaughtered. So yes, a death is taking place in your place, right? But the blood is being brought to the altar and therefore it covers the altar, right? Why? Because it covers over death. So the purpose of the blood is, and this is a weird concept for us to ponder in our modern culture, but the idea of the sacrifice of the blood is not so much the punishment of the animal. The point of it is that the animal's blood, which represents what? Life. That life is poured on the altar, it covers over death. So Yahshua's blood on the mercy seat, it covers over death because death cannot abide in the presence of Almighty Yahweh. So the idea is life covering death. That is the primary reason for the sin offering, is life cover over death, is to remove any trace of death because Yahweh is an Elohim of life. In my view, that's a much better, much more positive understanding of the sacrificial system than, well, this animal is punished in our place. You see the reframe there? And I'm not doing that just to do a sleight of hand with language. That is actually what the sacrificial system was like. And that is the point of the blood, is because the blood is the life in your place, and life is covering over death. And I've explained about leprosy and covering over the death of the leper, the walking dead person, right? So there's a lot that's going on there that we simply don't have the time to get into. But I need you to understand that mercy, that place of mercy is life covering death by means of his blood. He did this to demonstrate his covenant justice, his righteousness, because of the passing over in eternal forbearance, patience, of sins committed beforehand. By the way, notice that, of sins committed beforehand. Again, that's an important phrase that we can't get into right now. But when I just read from Leviticus, what did it say about the sin? That it was what? You remember the word that was used? Let me show it to you again. If any member of the community sins, what? Leviticus, could you see that? Leviticus 4:27. If any member of the community sins, what? Unintentionally. Unintentionally. Doesn't mean that you could do whatever you please and then go and do a sacrifice, right? So if it's unintentional, which is consistent with what Paul is saying here. because of the passing over, verse 25, of sins committed beforehand. The reason I make a big issue out of that is because this idea that we no longer have to keep the Torah in any way, shape, or form because sin was done, covered over by the blood of Yahshua, that's not consistent with what's being said here. Okay, so that's a topic for another day. This was to demonstrate, verse 26, his covenant justice in the present time. That is, that he himself is in the right, he, Yahshua, is in the right, and that he declares to be in the right everyone who trusts in the faithfulness of Yahshua. Actually, he himself, Yahweh himself, is in the right, and that he declares to be in the right everyone who trusts in the faithfulness of Yahshua. So what's happening here? And what is this? This was to demonstrate his covenant justice in the present time. So in chapter 2, he's talking about a future judgment. So he's saying, in verse 16, on the day when, according to the gospel I proclaim, Elohim judges all human secrets through King Yahshua. He's talking about a future justification that's going to occur, but there's also a present justification that's occurring. So what do I mean by that? It's a legal pronouncement. It's a legal pronouncement. Here's the heart of it. Okay, I know I'm kind of skipping over all kinds of stuff here, but here's what's at the heart of it. There's a justification that's being described for the present and a justification for the future. So it's as if Yahweh in chapter 2, he's giving you the end picture in sight. That in the future, all those who are in the Messiah, that term is used all throughout the New Testament, whoever is in the Messiah has already been declared by him to be in the right, to be legally in the right. So in the future, all those individuals will be saved because they are declared to be in the right because of Yahshua's sacrifice. But in the present, there is also a justification that is taking place with every person who is in Messiah, every individual, because of Yahshua's righteousness. So that's important because he wants a people who is going to be in partnership with him to bring his word to the world, to bring his gospel to the world about the coming king. And the only way that he could do that is by declaring those individuals in the right now, so that they can have clear consciences to go and do their thing, and that people will look at them and say, wow, this is a people that has been forgiven by Almighty Yahweh. Because what brought about that righteousness? Yahweh's forgiveness of all that idolatry and all those things that we were guilty of as a human race. He had to, it involves forgiveness. You can't have a return from exile unless your sins are forgiven. So in essence, and you look at other prophetic things where they say your sins are forgiven, right? So, wow, I'm just like all over the place because this is too much. Isaiah 40, I said, the message of the gospel, Isaiah 40, Isaiah 52, Isaiah 40, he says what? He says, comfort you, my people, says your Elohim. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her heart's service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from Yahweh's hand double for all her sins. So you don't walk around saying, oh, I'm still this miserable sinner because your sins have been forgiven. Doesn't mean you continue to sin, though, right? That's why I emphasize the thing about unintentional. But we're talking collectively as a people. If in order for Yahweh to declare us in the right, he had to forgive our sins. How does that happen? Through Yahshua's blood, which covers over our sins. You see all those things going on there? And then you look at a place like Isaiah 53 that melds two ideas together. The Passover sacrifice, which is the covering over of sin, and the freedom that comes from the freedom from exile in a foreign land, in Egypt. And then you also have the Day of Atonement service, which represents something else entirely as well, which is, the reconciliation to Almighty Yahweh. So there's all kinds of stuff going on here that we really, have to take some more time for. So let me just finish reading quickly through the rest of 3 and 4. So he says, verse 27, so what happens to boasting? So what is the boasting he's referring to? To the boasting of Jews who are saying, well, we got the upper hand because we have the Torah, etc. He said, no. It's ruled out. Through what sort of law? The law of works? No, through the law of faith. This is the law of faith. Faith in Yahshua's righteousness. And therefore, the fact that we are put in the right because of him. We calculate, we reckon. That term reckon, what is that? That's an accounting term. When you reckon this and that. We calculate, or you reckon, that a person is declared to be in the right on the basis of faith apart from the works of the law. Or does Elohim only belong to Jews? The answer is no. Doesn't he belong to the nations as well? Yes, of course, to the nations as well, since Elohim is one. And this goes back to the Shema, right? Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. He will make the declaration in the right over the uncircumcised on the basis of faith, and over the uncircumcised through faith. Let me read that again. He, Yahweh, will make the declaration in the right, justified. A legal proclamation, you are in the right. He will make the declaration in the right over the circumcised on the basis of faith, and over the uncircumcised through faith. Why the circumcised on the basis of faith? Who are the circumcised? The Jews, who were physically circumcised. So they're declared in the right, but not by works, not by all the things they did, because we already saw that they didn't keep it. They didn't keep the Torah. So they can't be. If it was just the Torah, then what's happening here? If it's just by Torah, no Gentile could ever come into the truth, because the Gentiles didn't have the Torah. The Jews had the Torah. So that distinction would always remain. Then, yes, you'd be able to boast if it was just by the Torah, because then you'd be able to say, we keep the Torah, we have the Torah, we keep it. But those Gentiles who don't have the Torah, they can never come into the king. They can never come into the family. It's like we see in Ephesians, right? In Ephesians, he tells you, he kind of summarizes it. Let's look at that very quickly. Am I clear with all this? Is it coming through? Okay, I know I'm trying to rush here, so it's coming a little choppy here, but just be with me here. So Ephesians 2, he kind of summarizes that, right? He says, verse 8, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. There it is again. And this is not from faith in what? Faith in Yahshua's, in what Yahshua did. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of Elohim, not by works, so that no one can boast. There it is again. You can't boast because it's through Torah. For we are Elohim's handiwork, created in Messiah Yahshua to do good works, which Elohim prepared in advance for us to do. Okay, that's the whole thing we have to go into. Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, remember that at that time you were separate from Messiah, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without Elohim in the world. But now, listen to that, without hope and without Elohim in the world, because you didn't have the Torah. But now in Messiah Yahshua, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. But this is when we have to get into what exactly does that works of the law mean, and what does law mean, right? Because anyway, I can't go into that right now. But the point is that we're all made one through this process. We're all made one through this process. Okay. Back to Romans 3. So he says, we calculate, verse 28, we calculate, you see, that a person is declared to be in the right on the basis of faith apart from works of the law. Or does Elohim only belong to the Jews? Doesn't he belong to the nations as well? Yes, of course, to the nations as well, since Elohim is one. He will make the declaration in the right over the circumcised on the basis of faith, because you, in effect, he's renewing the covenant with those who already had the Torah and had the covenant, and over the uncircumcised, who are the Gentiles, through faith. In other words, there's now a door that they're able to walk through. The Gentiles are able to walk through, because on the circumcised their covenant was renewed, because the full fruition of that faith has now come to pass with them in the Torah. The uncircumcised didn't have an opportunity before, but through this same faith, they're now able to come in, therefore fulfilling what Yahweh said to Abraham that he would do through him. Do you see that? I know I'm kind of all over the place, but in other words, he's saying nothing has changed except that it was done through one faithful Israelite rather than through the entire nation. So what Yahweh said he would do through Abraham, he has done through Yahshua the Messiah. And that faith in him, that faith in Yahshua, applies to everyone, Jew and Gentile. To the Jew, because he was already in that faith and he had it, and to the Gentile, because even though they didn't have it, through him, we're all equalized. like it says in Ephesians 2. Then he says, do we then abolish the law through faith? Certainly not. Rather, we establish the law. What does that mean? Well, it means that the law, there was nothing wrong with the law. We established the law. We confirmed that the law was right, but no one can boast in the law because it wasn't the law that brought you here, because not even the Jews kept it properly. So much more. And I can't even begin chapter 4 because we're already at 7 o'clock. Say again? Okay. Let me stop here, and then I want to take a poll here. No, I need you to help me to get a poll here. How do I do that? A poll. Yeah, literally a poll.